Welcome back. So, kittens are asleep now. So, this summer, one thing that I want to do is get into some old playlists that I haven't updated in a long time and start adding some videos to those playlists. And Truly Awful Seasons is one that I came up with years ago that I thought, that would be kind of fun to look back at really rough seasons that teams have. And so today I want to talk about the 98-99 Vancouver Canucks. Now, what's interesting is before the 97-98 season, this became their logo. And the 97-98 season was a complete, utter disaster. So was the 98-99 season. 99-2000 things start to get better. But I still think that for fans in my age range, that I think some of the negativity towards the Orca Bay ownership putting the Orca as their logo comes down to the fact that the team wasn't very good when they made the change. So the skate logo is there, then the team's getting bad, then this logo goes on, the team was awful. And yeah, I understood why people might have looked at that logo and said, that might be a jinx. There's also the Mark Messier side of it too. This is where we're into the Mark Messier era, and Mike Keenan was going into his first full season behind the bench, or what was intended to be his first full season behind the bench, after a very tumultuous first partial season behind the bench. So 98-99, the Canucks finished the season 23-47-12. 58 points for the Vancouver Canucks. Now, to put into perspective how bad this is, they finished behind the expansion Nashville Predators, who weren't very good. Their .354 points percentage was tied with the New York Islanders, and it was ahead of only the Tampa Bay Lightning, who had a .287. But the good news for Tampa fans was they were going to get better, and they were going to win a Stanley Cup 5 years after that. Vancouver, not so much. Although 5 years later, the Canucks were better than this. But then we're into a whole other disastrous area when you get to 2004 with the Canucks. Now, again, the captain's Mark Messier. And after Messier signed that big money contract, it basically put a bullseye on him. And I thought Messier played all right that year. So their leading scorers were, Naslund was the leading scorer, 80 games, 36 goals, 30 assists, 66 points. So the good news was that Marcus Naslund was starting to become the player that he would be when the Canucks got better. Mark Messier, 59 games played, 13 goals, 35 assists, 48 points. And the discussion was one of Messier kind of physically being done. That all of those playoff battles, all those regular season battles had worn him down. And the funny thing was that I thought Messier played all right that year. I remember that season, I thought Messier played fine, but he wasn't in the lineup often enough. McGillney, however, 59 games, 14 goals, 31 assists, 45 points. That was a tremendous disappointment with McGillney, both missing time and 14 goals. The Hockey News annual that I was going through for some of this said, super skilled McGillney fading into oblivion. So the following season, he would be traded. And this was where Brian Burke started really cleaning house. But yeah, McGillney, it was a disaster. And this, of course, was the year they traded Bure as well. The plan had always been simple. You've got Bure on one wing, McGillney on the other, profit. And it didn't work. It didn't work. At no point were both of them going. You would have either one of them doing really well or the other doing really well. Or one would be injured, the other would, maybe both are injured. And it was frustrating, right? It's one of those situations where on paper it should work. And in reality, it didn't. So they were 21st out of 27 teams in attendance. It was called GM Place at this point. 15,802 was the average attendance. And Rogers had only opened in 1995. So we're a few years into Rogers. It's now Rogers, GM Place then. It's easy to mess those two up. But yeah, it opened in 95 and we're already seeing empty seats, which doesn't look great. Brand new building, empty seats. And so, yeah, there's definitely some of what I talk about now when I talk about the market not having the patience for a rebuild, that I look back to that era and I say, yeah, attendance dropped pretty quick. Attendance in Vancouver has been known to drop pretty quickly. This was the second straight season as well that Vancouver was at the bottom of the West. Absolutely the lowest placed team in the West. Even though we'd had a bunch of expansion, Canucks were the lowest in the West. So, under Mike Keenan, they were 15, 24, and 6. Then they move him out. Mark Crawford comes in. The funny thing is, the record under Crawford actually gets worse. 8, 23, and 6. Though I thought the Canucks were a little better under Crawford. But yeah, for Mark Crawford, who had fantastic coaching statistics in the NHL before joining the Canucks, that was rough. The good news for Crawford was it would get better every year after that. They did start the season 4-2, and it's kind of a fool's gold situation. They win 4 of their first 6. Things are looking good. Maybe they turn it around. They did not. November 21st through 29th, they lose 5 straight. December 26th through January 6th, they lost 7 straight. March 13th to 25th, they lost 6 straight. And then March 31st to April 7th, they lost 5 straight. And they are one of those teams that had a bad record, and then after the deadline, it got worse. Trade deadline time, it just gets worse. The key date in this season, there's a couple. January 18th of 1999, they trade Pavel Bure. And it is a huge deal. Arguably one of the biggest the Canucks had ever made to that point. It's Pavel Bure, Brett Hedican, the rights to Brad Ferentz, and a 2000 third-round pick to Florida in exchange for Ed Jovanovski, Dave Gagne, Mike Brown, the rights to Kevin Weeks, and a 2000 first that became Nathan Smith. So what's interesting with that trade was that Brian Burke had insisted on Dave Gagne being in there. Really wanted Dave Gagne to be a part of the trade. Dave Gagne, a player that I liked a lot when he was at his prime, but at this point, Gagne was done. Gagne was done, and it was one of those oddities of that trade. And then Jovanovski, pretty decent throw-in. Jovanovski did not have a great debut with the Canucks for the rest of that season, but who did? Who did? Nobody really did. So Crawford took over January 24th. Now, the reason this is interesting is because word had it that when they made this deal with Bure, that Burke went over it with Mike Keenan, said, "What do you think of this deal?" And Keenan's like, "Yeah, that sounds good." And then he makes the trade, and then Keenan's fired within a week after that. So there was definitely some discussions to be had about that. Like, hey, what do you think about this? That's a good trade. Thanks for your advice. You're fired, by the way. So, yeah, Crawford takes over, which definitely signaled a new era. Mark Crawford coming to Vancouver was big. The other thing that was big with the Canucks was when you're into 98-99, you're getting into really defensive hockey. Don't care about goals for, it's all about goals against. The Canucks never embraced the trap. The Canucks never became a team that played the trap and played that really boring style of hockey. Not in this stage, not at this time. There have been years where the Canucks have played a trap-like style of hockey that can be hard to watch. This wasn't one of them. It was hard to watch for Canuck fans. Other fans were delighted. Fans of other teams were delighted to see the Vancouver Canucks, within a few years of being in the Stanley Cup final, being at the bottom of the league, having a logo that their own fan base wasn't a fan of, and the team being in complete turmoil. I think there were fans around the rest of the NHL that were quite happy about that. So, goaltending. Goaltending was a problem. So this is this is the goalie graveyard era. This is where Brian Burke famously said that Vancouver was a goalie graveyard. And I remember at the time saying, "You're the GM. What are you doing?" So that year it wasn't so much a graveyard. Garth Snow, 20, 31, and 8, 6 shutouts, a .900 save percentage, and I believe that was the year he was named team MVP. And it might have been by default, and also because Garth Snow was a pretty good soldier about playing behind what was a porous defense. The defense for the Canucks was bad that year. Corey Hirsch, 3-8 and 3, 890 save percentage. He exited as a free agent that summer. And they acquired Kevin Weeks in that deal with the Florida Panthers. Now, this is where Brian Burke says, this is the goalie of the future. Kevin Weeks is the goalie of the future. Now, Weeks had a rough time of it. He was 0-8 and 1 with the Canucks and an 868 save percentage. So what that means is that even though in, again, the hockey annuals I'm looking at, it was known before the season started the Vancouver Canucks needed help in net. He didn't do anything over the summer to fix the goaltending problem. And bringing in Kevin Weeks obviously doesn't end up being the permanent solution. Garth Snow, not the permanent solution or long-term solution. I guess there is no permanent solution because eventually a goalie's going to be gone. But it was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. So they used 3 goalies that year. Not so much a graveyard, but they used 5. They used 5 in 99-2000 the following year. They did improve by 25 points in 99-2000. The year before this season, they used 5 goalies as well. And yeah, it was just a disaster. Now the special teams, head scratching. Their power play 12.9%. So even though Bure had held out and decided he wasn't reporting, fine, all right, and he doesn't report, and then he gets traded to Florida. Okay, cool. McGillney should have made that power play better than 12.9%. Messier, even if his effectiveness was less than what it was with the Rangers or with the Oilers, he still should have been able to help. There were players here that should have been able to at least get that power play to, I don't know, 15%. It just wasn't there. Their penalty kill, not bad, 82.2%, but that power play, just miserable. They allowed 6 or more goals 11 times that year. 11. It's a lot. 258 goals against was third worst in the league. Nashville had 261 goals against. Tampa Bay had 292 goals against. Dallas was actually number one in the NHL in goals against that year, 168 goals against in 82 games. That's ridiculously low, which is almost 100 less goals against than Vancouver had. So it's a lot. Of course, Dallas did win the Stanley Cup that year. Defense can win you championships. So the Sedins were drafted that summer. 99, the summer of 99 is where things would show signs they would get better. The Sedins are drafted 2 and 3. Without this season, Brian Burke isn't able to work his magic. The Canucks wouldn't have had a top draft pick that they could then turn into 2 top draft picks. And what's interesting that season too is that Adrian Aucoin would have a career year. So while the Vancouver Canucks weren't scoring goals, Aucoin was. He had 23 goals that year. So a team that only had 192 goals and wasn't scoring very well, and Aucoin, tons. And I remember being confused at the time, being like, should we trade Aucoin because he's having a career year? Should they just trade him? Because what's going on here? But yeah, 23 goals. And then after the season was done, they bought out Dave Gagne. Dave Gagne in Vancouver, 33 games, 2 goals, 12 assists, 14 points. Not what Burke was envisioning when he insisted on having him as part of that trade. Now, they were 4-4-1 in October. So not a bad October, although they were 4-2 to start the month. And then it falls off the rails. November they were 5-9, December 4-6-3, January 3-6-2, February 3-8-3, March 3-9-2, and in April 1-5-1. So again, after the deadline, they really fell off as well, but they really didn't have a good record to start with. They were actually 4-2 against Calgary that year, 0-5-1 against Edmonton, so they could beat Calgary, they couldn't beat Edmonton. Against Nashville, the expansion team in the NHL, they were 1-3. So again, mildly humiliating for the Vancouver Canucks to see themselves 5 points back of the Nashville Predators. But again, it worked out okay for them at the draft table. And if they'd finished ahead of Nashville, we might not have been talking about the Sedins being Canucks for the last 2 decades and 2 decades plus, really. Because considering after their retirement, they're still in the Vancouver organization. Interesting, too, from that season, Todd Bertuzzi, who had been acquired in the infamous Trevor Linden deal. 32 games, 8 goals, 8 assists, 16 points that year for Vancouver. He looked good at times, and I remember thinking he might be a 20-goal scorer next year then. We had no idea what was coming. Bertuzzi, though, really hadn't shown what he would show later on in terms of his play offensively. And then one of the funniest things from that season was Brandon Convery. Brandon Convery, player that I've never mentioned on the channel before. There isn't enough there for me to really do a career video either. But I'm going to say this right now. He was fantastic. He had 12 games, 2 goals, 7 assists, 9 points. He was a +5. He was a +5 on a Vancouver team that was not a plus anywhere. And so Convery with 9 points in 12 games, that's pretty good, right? Yeah, they waived him. They waived him on November 21st. He gets claimed by the Los Angeles Kings on waivers, only plays 3 games for LA, and that wound up his NHL career. He never played again. I remember being upset because Convery's totals on a Canuck team that was awful weren't bad. And I'm not saying Convery was going to be great, but on this team that had 23 wins in 82 games, that 9 points in 12 games for Convery, and then he's out. Okay, it felt like they got rid of him because he was out playing other players and he was making people feel bad about themselves. That was my theory at the time. I still haven't seen anything to tell me that wasn't the case. But again, he only played 3 more games in the NHL and then it was done. So I felt bad for him because I was like, he was scoring all right in Vancouver. I don't know why they didn't at least keep him around. I mean, it's not like the season they were going anywhere. It was just a complete disaster. But that's how things worked. Brian Burke was one GM that he really made up his mind on certain players, and he stuck with it, which I respect. I know the season before this one, Artur Serbe played well, and he was the best goaltender, so they let him go because he was short. It was a different time. It was bizarre. Just imagine if the Nashville Predators came out and said, well, we let go of Saros because he's not 6 feet tall, so we decided to move on and pick up a goaltender because he's... And it felt like that's what was going on in Vancouver. So, anyways, the goalie issue would continue to be a problem. In 2000, 2001, they would pick up Dan Cloutier. He became the starter. In theory, that solved all the problems in net for Vancouver going forward. It was a frustrating era for Canuck fans because we knew that if they had like a premier goaltender or a Wah Hasek type, they might have won a Stanley Cup. But it doesn't happen. At the very least, though, it does get better than this. To me, this was the absolute bottom. The Messier buyout would actually be after the following season, where they finally decided that the Messier experiment was not working. But yeah, it was one of those things that it's a learning experience, and learning experiences are never fun. Although looking back at this kind of is, because it has been enough years removed between then and now that I can talk about it and go, yeah, so that happened, is all fine. It's all fine because it's a long time ago. But there you go. The 97 or 90, 97, 98. So keep wanting to say 97, 98 because that was a disaster too. So really flip a coin. I could have talked about either season, but I opted for 98, 99 because you could see that there was something good coming later on. Like I said, McGillney would get traded the following season in a trade that involved Brennan Morrison coming back to Vancouver, and that, of course, puts together the West Coast Express the following season, and then things go pretty darn well. But there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.